Every year, when I release my various slider sets, one of the most common requests I get is to release a CPU versus CPU slider set. Now, long gone are the days where we would have to use the player lock workaround to actually get a CPU versus CPU match. We do, of course, now have tactical view as an option. And with the addition of FC IQ, I think now could be the best time to actually utilize tactical view, not just from game to game, but for an entire career mode. So in today's video, we're going to be going over a set of settings and sliders that you can use to get some balanced, enjoyable, realistic gameplay using the tactical view. Now, a couple things to note before we get started. First is the settings. I have released a complete breakdown video where I go over every single setting and every single slider I would use to create a realistic career mode. Most of those settings are going to apply here as well. So check out that video if you do want a full breakdown of every single setting. But for the ones that will be different here for the tactical view career mode, you're going to want to use 6-minute halves rather than the 10 minutes that I recommend in the complete breakdown video. And then you are certainly going to want to use legendary difficulty as well. Of course, if you're playing the games, the difficulty is going to change, but when it's CPU versus CPU, tactical view, legendary is the recommended difficulty. With legendary, you get the maximum AI kind of sharpness and intelligence, obviously more so than you would on world class. But on ultimate, what happens is every player on the CPU team at the very least becomes a 99 overall, which obviously greatly reduces the differentiation between individual players. So you don't want to step up to ultimate for that reason. Legendary is the highest you can go to get the most intelligent play out of each of the teams, but still keeping it realistic and still maintaining that differentiation between the players. Another thing to note is that whilst I think FC25 does have some of the most realistic CPU versus CPU gameplay I have seen, it's still not a sim engine. It's not Football Manager. The primary and intended use of the game is for you to actually play the games. It's not built, it's not designed as a sim engine. So for that reason, things are still going to look a little bit wonky from time to time. Some of the animations might not be as smooth as they could be. Some of the CPU behavior might not necessarily make sense in every single situation, but simulating games is certainly a secondary use of the game, and again, not what the game was built or really intended for. Additionally, because we are using those shorter halves, the game is going to be a bit more end-to-end than you might be used to, especially if you do use my sliders. We like to expand to 10-minute halves. We like to slow the game right down. I imagine people probably don't want to sit there and watch a CPU versus CPU tactical view game for 20 plus minutes. So we've reduced the half length. However, that does of course mean if we still want a realistic number of shots per game, we're going to have to increase the speed, the attacking threat from each team fairly significantly. There's basically two options you can have. You can slow the game down and have it look realistic, but have a fewer number of shots per game, or you can speed the game up, have it be a little bit more end-to-end than you might like, but have kind of realistic statistics, especially in terms of shots at the end of the game. So the final thing to note is that although these sliders are designed for tactical view, so CPU versus CPU, you as the user still do need to take an active role in the games. You obviously won't be controlling any of the players, but you are still controlling your team. It is still going to be your responsibility to set some tactics that work for your team, to assign player roles that allow your players to succeed, to make changes in game like substitutions and switching between tactics, switching to the attacking mentality and the defensive mentality depending on the game state. You can't just plug in these sliders, put the controller down and completely leave the CPU to it. Obviously, games go through different periods, different situations, different stages. You do still need to react to those to generate the most realistic outcome possible. So with that being said, let's get into the sliders themselves. I do have the same sprint speed and acceleration that I recommend for user-controlled games. This just gives you the best balance in terms of slowing the game down, but also getting the smoothest possible animations. In the user-controlled games, I do recommend a disparity in acceleration, giving the user a +2 basically. So the CPU would have 46 acceleration, but here you would want 42, 42, 48, and 48 for both the user and the CPU teams. Shot error can be bumped up relatively significantly, so up to 65 for the user and the CPU. Pass error can remain at default at 50. Shot speed and pass speed are again close to what they would be in the user controlled sliders, but slightly different. So shot speed is down at 32 for the user and the CPU. One of the biggest problems that you have to address when designing a CPU versus CPU set is goals per game. There are far too many. Reducing the shot speed is one of the most reliable ways to reduce goals per game. Obviously, in addition to other things like run frequency and, of course, goalkeeper ability. However, I've said this numerous times before, you don't want to raise goalkeeper ability too high. However, there are some very high values, which we will get into for goalkeeper ability in just a little while. But shot speed is far more impactful for reducing the number of goals per game without making goalkeepers too overpowered and making them, allowing them to make ridiculous saves with crazy animations that they shouldn't be able to make, because the shot speed obviously reduces the speed of the shot. That in turn gives the goalkeeper more time to react to that shot. So you get more clean, more smooth, more realistic animations, but you also increase the likelihood that the goalkeeper can make the save. Pass speed has also been reduced from default. This is at 36 for the user, 36 for the CPU. I did try and drop this even further than 36, just to try and slow the game down even further and try and replicate more the kind of the speed of football that you would see if you were watching it on television. 36 is a little bit, it does appear a little bit faster than you would see if watching a real football game. However, you can't really go any lower than this without it having certain knock-on effects that would be a detriment to the game, essentially. Injury frequency and injury severity, I do just have it 78 and 17 for both the user and the CPU. Injury sliders, very much in flux at the moment. It takes a long time to settle on a set of injury sliders. Right now, I can only find broken toes constantly, 3 months, or bruised shoulders constantly, 5 days. I'm really struggling to find values where you get a variation, a variety of injuries. So please feel free to leave any suggestions in the comments. The next values I'm going to try, so it might be worth trying this in your career modes, is 75 for frequency and 25 for severity. I haven't tested this yet. I will be shortly, so you can chuck those values in. Injury, frequency, and severity obviously don't have a significant impact on the gameplay. However, onto goalkeeper ability. So I said earlier, there's going to be some incredibly high values here, and we do actually see our first disparity as well between the user and the CPU values. I said ordinarily we don't want to raise these too high because it can sometimes encourage unrealistic animations from the goalkeeper, when reducing the shot speed would be the far better approach. However, we've already reduced shot speed. We can't really reduce it any further, and there are still too many goals per game. So we do have to raise the goalkeeper ability slider values as well. So the user goes all the way up to 90, whereas the CPU only goes up to 75. Even on tactical view, even in CPU versus CPU games, the CPU goalkeeper is just better than the user goalkeeper. That's clearly the case in user-controlled games, and it is even the case in CPU versus CPU. Technically, the game doesn't even really recognize it as CPU versus CPU. Although you're not controlling any players on the user team, the CPU is obviously controlling all of your players. It still counts your team as the user team. And there are some kind of behind the scenes buffs and kind of subtractions to certain things that do influence the gameplay. Goalkeeper ability is clearly one of them. So we do need to give the user goalkeeper a slight bump. Marking we have slightly higher than in the user controlled set. So this should go at 70 for the user and for the CPU. And then we get to our other discrepancy, and it's far more significant than goalkeeper ability. This is run frequency. So this is another one where behind the scenes, just the user and the CPU teams are not considered equally. And again, although it's two CPU versus CPU teams, it's not really. You're still a user controlled team, even if you're not controlling any of the players. So user run frequency should be all the way down at 20. CPU run frequency should be all the way up at 90. So your players on the user controlled team are have far more initiative to break forward and make those forward runs. And they do it far too often. When we have these values even close to even, the user team will just swarm the CPU team every time. It will be relentless, attack after attack. The CPU team, the opposite. CPU we can obviously pair with the build-up speed slider, which we will get to in just a bit as well. But we need to encourage far more forward runs from the CPU team, and we can do that by greatly increasing the run frequency slider. Line height, length, and width all remain the same as in the user-controlled set. So 35 for the line height, 40 for the length, and 45 for the width for both the user and the CPU. This still just provides the best overall shape of the game in terms of where the teams will be positioned at various stages in attack and defense. Fullback positioning can be 50-50, so just at default for both the user and the CPU. The power bar obviously has no impact because these are simulated games. And then the first touch control error as well is fine at default for both the user and the CPU. Now, one of the reasons that we had a couple of discrepancies in terms of the values of a few of those main sliders is because this year we do, of course, also have the CPU sliders, and these will affect the behavior of the CPU team. So again, although this is tactical view, it's CPU versus CPU, you are still considered the user team. Your opposition is still considered the CPU team. So these sliders will only apply to the team that you are facing in a given game. These will not apply to your players, even though your players are technically controlled by the CPU. However, some of these tendencies will, of course, have an impact on the way that the CPU team behaves, which again is why there are a couple of discrepancies, particularly with the run frequency and the build-up speed. Build-up speed you want to set at 50. That paired with the run frequency of 90, whereas the user is at 20, those things should combine to give you a good balanced back and forth between the two sides. You are going to want to set tackle aggression to 99. Shot frequency should be at 60. First touch pass frequency at 55. Crossing frequency at 70. Dribble frequency at 60. And then skill move frequency at 50. One thing I suggested in my most recent edition, so version 2 of my, ordinary user-controlled slider set, though, is to create your own value range for these sliders. So the advantage of using a custom slider set here in the CPU sliders, like this one, is that we can guarantee that the CPU are going to play in a realistic way because I'm dictating how quickly they build up, how often they take shots, and those kinds of things. The downside of using something like tactical or dynamic is that those values fluctuate from game to game. So you might end up with build-up speed set at 1, and you're going to have a wildly unrealistic game because the CPU are never going to make it out of their own half. However, the advantage of using tactical or dynamic and the disadvantage of using a custom set like this one is that there's less differentiation between teams. There is still some differentiation because team tactics, player roles, those kinds of things still make an impact, as of course does the strength of the team, how good are the players on the CPU team. But with tactical and dynamic, with these values fluctuating from game to game, that obviously creates even more of a differentiation between the teams. So one way that you can bridge that gap, one way that you can ensure that you have a realistic game, but you can differentiate even more from team to team, is set your own value range for each of these individual sliders. So for example, you might decide build up speed, I'm going to set anywhere between 45 and 55. And before each game, you can randomize these values. You can determine which value you want to set this at. You set this at a unique value between 45 and 55 ahead of each game. Do that for each of these values. Set a range of 5 to 10 points, I would say. Randomize them before each game, and then you guarantee you're going to get a realistic game because you're defining the parameters, but the sliders are going to fluctuate on a game-to-game basis. So I will put these in the description as well, but here is the full set of the main sliders in its entirety. Feel free to pause the video. And then here is the full set of the CPU sliders, complete with the value ranges as well as the individual values that I suggest as well. But that'll do it for this video. As always, let me know how these sliders play for you. Let me know in the comments below if you think there should be any changes, any suggestions that you have for slider values, again, particularly for those injury frequency and severity sliders. If you are new to the channel, there's a couple of things you can check out that might be of interest to you. First is the set of user-controlled sliders. I assume most people playing Tactical View will be playing games at some point as well, so check out my realistic slider set for the user-controlled games. Check out my realistic Crystal Palace career mode featuring ChatGPT as well. And of course, feel free to subscribe if you do want to be kept up to date with all of my slider sets as they change and develop over the course of the year. But that'll do it for this one. I hope to see you in the next one. Take it easy.